Hello and welcome back to Business Law Online. This lecture we will be finishing up contracts and hopefully it won't be too much longer. Last lecture I introduced you to an acronym, TACO, to help you learn and understand the elements of a contract. The T stands for essential terms, the O stands for offer, and the A stands for acceptance. Today we're going to talk about the C, consideration. Now, consideration, what is consideration? It is the mutual inducement to the contract. It is why both sides decided to enter into this legally binding agreement. Both sides have given up something. It could be a price, it could be the exchange of goods, it could be a detriment. Both sides have given up something. A good example of a detriment, for instance, is with an options contract, which we talked about last class when we were talking about the different types of contracts. Options contracts, they are what? When the offeror agrees to hold an offer open to an offeree in exchange for what? For some kind of payment. Okay. What is the offeror giving up? Well, they're giving up their right to call another party and make that same offer to them. That's a detriment. So that's a good example of a detriment. Consideration has got to be bargained for at arm's length between two or more parties. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that the parties have exactly the same bargaining strength, but that there is no overreaching. One party is not taking gross advantage of another party's inexperience, for instance. So there's no overreaching. Now, typically, of course, consideration is the exchange of mutual promises, a bilateral contract, but it can also be a unilateral contract. You have a promise in exchange for performance. Now, I want to stress again that it's got to be mutual. If it's not mutual, if only one side is giving up something, what is that? That's a gift. That's not a contract. Really important to keep that straight. Now, what about this? What if, for instance, well, let's use this as a dramatic example. There was a couple in Pennsylvania, and they like to go to like different antique sales and the like. And at one of these sales, the wife, a picture caught her eye. Not because of the picture itself, she liked the frame. The wife and the husband approached the vendor and said, how much? And the vendor said, $20. The husband paid the $20 and they went on their way. The wife and the husband went home. The husband took the picture and wanted to take it apart because the wife really wasn't interested in the picture. She was really more interested in the frame. He started to take the frame apart. He took the backing off. And in the backing, there were papers between the backing and the picture itself, including an original copy of the Declaration of Independence. Wow, that's some find. What about the party, the vendor who sold them the picture? Could they potentially get that picture back and give back the $20? It really wasn't a fair deal, was it? Wasn't a fair deal at all. I mean, when you have a historical document, I think they subsequently sold it to the National Archive for $1.6 or $1.5 million or something like that. A lot of money. And it was only a $20 investment. That's really, really grossly unfair. What about this situation? If any of you have ever watched Antique Roadshow, a woman went into a thrift store in Milwaukee. She was looking for a red vase. She saw two of them up on a shelf. And they caught her eye, and she looked at them. She picked them up. They were marked $10 each. She picked them up, and underneath it was stamped Tiffany's. I'm sure all of you know what Tiffany's is. She subsequently went on the Antique Roadshow, and she was told that, yes, indeed, these are authentic Tiffany's vases from the 1920s. Each one, I believe, was worth between $10,000 and $15,000. What about that vendor? If he's watching the Antique Roadshow and he sees that woman and the vases that he sold her, could he get it back? Well, probably not. Probably not. Consideration is not fair value. It's not market value. Please understand that. It is legal value. That's it. That's it. Unless you can prove some kind of fraud or to the inducement of the contract or some kind of other misgiving, if it's just a bad deal, it's a bad deal. Both sides have given up something of legal value, and as far as the courts are concerned, that's enough. All right. What about this kind of scenario? Your parents are elderly, and you've been taking care of them just because you're a good son or daughter. You go over their house, you take care of the house chores and do the shopping and everything like that. And your parents come to you and they say, you know, you've really been taking care of us a lot. We want to pay you $10,000. $10,000 for taking care of us. Is that a legally enforceable contract? Well, one of the things about consideration, it's got to be bargained for. Was it bargained for? No, it wasn't. So although it might be a gift, it's not a contract. What about this situation? You are a vendor and you're selling me men's suits. And you tell me, I'm going to sell you 200 suits, Professor Ertel, at $100 per unit. And I say, fine, I'll take that offer. You deliver the suits and I pay you the money. We both have the contract is now fully executed. We've both performed our promises. You delivered all 200 suits. I paid you $20,000 in full satisfaction. A week later, you come back to me and say, you know, Professor Ertel, you know, I really need another $50 per unit on the suit. In other words, another $10,000. What if I were to say, yeah, sure. Is that legally enforceable? No, it's not. Why? Because it's got to be mutual. The contract was fully performed. It was completed. If you want more money, if you want me to give you consideration, you must now give me new consideration. That's referred to as the pre-existing duty rule. We both fulfilled our duties under the contract. I paid you in full. Now you just want more money, but you're not what? You're not willing to give me some kind of additional consideration. The pre-existing duty rule, that applies to when the contract has been fully performed. In that situation, there's no new consideration. Therefore, no, it's not legally enforceable. But the restatement of contracts and also the UCC section 2.209, as well as various state laws, they do provide, however, that in that situation, if the vendor has a good faith reason for seeking that kind of modification, more money, then maybe that type of promise is enforceable as a contract. For instance, suppose the suits are wool and there was a blight that wiped out half the sheep population in all the wool-producing nations of the world. All of a sudden, there were half as many sheep. Now, what's going to happen then to the price of wool? It's going to go up a lot. Well, in that situation, do you want more money just because you want more money? Or is there actually a good faith reason for it? That's arguably a good faith reason for it. So in that situation, the law may provide for a modification. What about this situation? Okay. I hire a contractor to build a garage. I agree to pay them $10,000, $5,000 up front, $2,500 during the course of construction, and another $2,500 when the job is complete. Well, I pay him the $5,000. Construction begins. I pay him another $2,500 during the construction itself, and now I have another $2,500 that I owe him. At the end of construction, I say, I'm not satisfied with the job you've done. I think it's subpar workmanship, really poor craftsmanship. There are lots of mistakes with it. Could he agree to that? Is it possible that he agreed to that? If he agrees not to accept the $2,500 that I owe him, the balance, is it possible that is legally enforceable? Well, it is. That's referred to as accord and satisfaction. What that means is it's a debt. It's compromising an original debt. So although I originally owed him $10,000, he's agreed to compromise that debt. Why? Now, accord and satisfaction, that applies to after the contract, during the contract, while the contract is being fulfilled. Why? What are both sides giving up? Well, I'm giving up a detriment. I'm giving up my right to have a perfectly built garage. It's now a subpar garage. And what is he giving up? Well, he's giving up the right. What's he getting in return for that $2,500? Not to be sued because of that. So both sides are giving up something. That's something of legal value. That is valid consideration. All right, so consideration, really important issue. The big thing here, it's got to be mutual, bargained for, and it's got to be legal value. All right. What if there is a mutual mistake as to value? And that kind of applies to what we were discussing before. About the Declaration of Independence and also the Tiffany vases. The courts will not void that contract as long as the object was identified. So in the first example, a picture with picture frame. That's probably enough. The second example, a Tiffany's vase, or just a vase. That's enough. That's enough. So why? Because it's what? Again, it's up to both sides to do their due diligence. All right. Now, what about lawsuits? What about lawsuits involving contracts? There are two causes of action. One we kind of covered before in torts, fraudulent misrepresentation. Now, with fraudulent misrepresentation, the plaintiff has to prove the following. One, the wrongdoer made a false representation of a past or present material fact. Two, the wrongdoer intended to deceive the innocent party and acted with malice. In other words, they wanted to fool the plaintiff. Three, the innocent party justifiably relied on the fraudulent misrepresentation. And finally, four, damages. And the example I gave for that during my torts lecture was, well, what if you go to a used car lot? And because you decide, after college, you're going to need a car to get around. Used cars are usually much less expensive than new cars. You want to save some money. And the salesman on the used car lot says, what? Oh, this car is perfect for you. It's got a brand new transmission, brand new brakes, and 4 new brand new tires. Well, and you buy the car based upon those representations. First, are those material facts? Absolutely, absolutely. Those are big ticket items for any car. If they're new, then that's probably not a bad deal or a good thing. What about intent to deceive? Well, here, the wrongdoer, they're really in a position to know that's not true. And plus the misrepresentations were so blatant, I don't think it'd be hard to prove that they acted with malice. What about you justifiably relying on it? And I think that's pretty reasonable. After all, unless you're a mechanic and you looked at a transmission, how would you know? Unless you're a mechanic and looked at the brake pads, how would you know whether or not there are new brake pads? Even tires, you may not know. So I think it's justifiable. And fourth, of course, you have to have damages. What are the damages? Well, it could be measured in different ways. Could be the value of a car as it was represented versus the value of the car as it really is. That could be a measure of damages as well. All right. The other lawsuit involving contracts, and in that situation, by the way, if you could prove fraudulent misrepresentation, you can void the contract. Why? Because your inducement was not voluntary. And remember, contracts are always what? Voluntary agreements. There's no duress. There's no fraud. The other cause of action are unconscionable contracts. Now, unconscionable contracts are grossly unfair, and the court will look at three factors. One, the bargaining powers of the parties. Two, whether or not the dominant party unreasonably used its bargaining power. And three, the other party had no alternative. I think a fun example of explaining this is one of my favorite television shows, Pawn Stars, P-A-W-N, Stars. The Harrison family, Rick Harrison, his son, and his father, they own a pawn shop in where else? Las Vegas. And they certainly have acquired a lot of expertise about different items. And one time, a woman came in with a beautiful brooch, a spider brooch, very elegant, obviously even to an untrained eye, filled with precious and semi-precious stones. It was big too. It was a big brooch. And the woman came in and said, I found this in my grandmother's dresser drawer, and it's really pretty, but I'd like to sell it. And Rick Harrison asked, well, how much would you like for it? And she said $2,000. And Rick Harrison, to his credit, said, I would take the deal, but I have a conscience. How about $15,000? Now, what if Rick Harrison, his explanation for it was, well, this is a Fabergé brooch from before the Russian Revolution. This thing is worth a lot more than $2,000. And the fact that he offered $15,000 probably means it's probably worth what? Closer to $30,000. But he, obviously would have made. I mean, that's an issue of wholesale versus retail, etc. But I mean, could you imagine if he had bought it for $2,000? He could have sold it for at least 15 times the price, maybe even more. But there, suppose he had said, sure, I'll give you $2,000 for it. Could she have had a case could she have voided that contract claiming it was unconscionable? Look at number two, whether the dominant party unreasonably used its bargaining power. Rick obviously knew what it was. Maybe that's a real issue of fact there, whether or not he did unreasonably use his bargaining power. If it's obviously worth many times more than $2,000, had he accepted that offer, maybe she would have had a case. The other two elements might be harder for her to prove. She had no other alternative. Well, I'm sure there were other pawn shops in Las Vegas and other places that you could sell the brooch. And the bargaining powers of the parties. Well, maybe if she was desperate, maybe she was on the verge of bankruptcy and just trying to raise money to avoid it. Maybe that would have been she would have been able to prove that. All right. Now, when we were discussing the different types of contracts, some contracts, express contracts are verbal. And they include both written contracts and also verbal contracts. But the law has recognized over hundreds of years that basically certain contracts are so important that they must be in writing. And that's referred to as the statute of frauds. Now, the statute of frauds varies from state to state, but basically they all cover the following. One, surety contracts. What is a surety contract? That's when one party promises to pay the debts of another party. That comes up, for instance, when one business buys another business. Oftentimes, the business buying the other business will agree to pay the debts of that business. So a surety contract, when it's the promise to pay another party's debts. Another example, the promise for the sale of goods exceeding $500 in good faith. So anything more than $500 has got to be in writing. Well, what about when you go to the store and you buy $500 worth of merchandise? Should that be in writing? Yes. And what is your contract? It's your receipt. Okay. The sale of security, basically stocks. Also, co-ops. Co-ops are legally not real estate. Legally, co-ops are stock. You actually buy stock in the co-op corporation when you buy a co-op. What you're doing is that stock gives you the right to lease the unit within the co-op corporation's building. So the sale of security, stock or cooperative apartments are good examples. The sale of real estate. If you're selling your home or buying your home, it's got to be in writing. The sale of intangible property, which is not a security or a good, worth more than $5,000. Well, what's intangible property? Well, we haven't covered it yet, but a good example of that would be, for instance, a partnership interest. If you have a business and you have a partner, and the other partner wants to buy you out, and in good faith that your share is worth more than $5,000, it's got to be in writing. Finder's fees, broker's fees, they have to be in writing as well. The promise to pay one's debts discharged in bankruptcy. Why? Well, when you're, hopefully none of you ever have to file for bankruptcy, but if you did, especially if you filed for Chapter 7, total liquidation bankruptcy, at the end of that proceeding, you are no longer legally obligated to pay those debts. So any promise to pay those debts has got to be in writing. The promise incapable of performance within 1 year from its making. It can't be done within 1 year. If it falls within 1 year, the statute of frauds does not apply. Finally, the promise of marriage in exchange for money. This was added in the 1920s. There were a lot of interesting cases of celebrities who were being sued by women claiming that they promised to marry, that the celebrity promised to marry them, or that they promised to marry the celebrity in exchange for all kinds of gifts and the like. All right, so all those contracts have got to be in writing. Now, the statute of frauds is actually an affirmative defense. You got to waive it. You have to raise it in your answer, or it is waived. So that's an important thing to know. Now, what about a written contract? How are they interpreted? Generally speaking, contracts are interpreted according to the four corners rule. What does that mean? That means that the contract must be defined, any terms in the contract must be defined within the contract. You cannot look at extraneous evidence. For instance, prior negotiations, emails, writings back and forth. You cannot look to any of those to interpret the contract. Now, there are some exceptions to that. One, if something was not covered in the contract, then you can look at it. You can look at extraneous writings. Or that, too, that the contract is otherwise incomplete. That's another exception, that you can look at extraneous evidence in interpreting the contract. But basically, the parole evidence rule, it's based on the assumption that the parties who entered into the contract want that contract to be the final say of their intentions, the final meaning of their intent. So therefore, any extraneous or extra writings or negotiations are not part of interpreting that contract. All right. Well, keep up to date with the assignments. There will be another assignment. And please email me any questions or even drop by. Thank you and have a good one.